All right, we can begin.
Okay, we are here. I'm Pedro Funari, University of Campinas, and we are receiving today Professor Chris Gosden, Oxford University. And we are also with Filipe Noé da Silva, who is lecturer in Universidade Estadual de Florianópolis, and Sofia Helena, who is a master's degree at Unicamp too. So first of all, thanks so much, Professor Gosden, accepting our invitation to talk to us and to allow us to share this interview with a broader public via our website in the Institute of Philosophy of University of Campinas. Thank you so much.
It's a great honor, and thank you very much indeed. It's a real pleasure.
Well, the first thing is to say that the interest in your publications, in your activities, is very wide in Brazil and all over Latin America, particularly in the classics in relation to prehistory and archaeology and colonialism, but recently also in the new book on magic, a very enticing subject. So it is an honor to be able to talk to you today and to share ideas.
Yeah, nice.
Well, the first, before starting our questions on specific issues, we would like to hear you about your commitment to archaeology, prehistory, anthropology. How did you come up with this in your life and career?
Yeah, well, that's a good and big question. I suppose I like archaeology because it allows you to combine a more sort of philosophical questioning of, what's the world like? How do we think about things like human difference and diversity? On the one hand, some of those big questions of what it means to be human with physical work. And I think both of those things are very important. I really love excavating archaeological sites. And I don't know of many other disciplines, really any other discipline, that allows you the sort of both the philosophical and the physical engagement, one at the same time. And I can't imagine, I mean, I'm not clever enough to be a philosopher anyway, but I can't imagine just thinking philosophically without the possibility of pickaxing and shoveling and doing those other things. But also, archaeology is not something you can do on your own. Well, by archaeological fieldwork, that is. So it's a profoundly social thing to do. You work with other people in your team. You work with various different communities around the world. And I think those sorts of things are really, really important to me. So yes, at the age of 18, when I first went on an archaeological site, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I came from a background where nobody had been to university, so that didn't occur to me. And then I discovered archaeology, and I thought, yes, I can imagine doing this. And then also started to think, well, maybe I could go to university and study this.
It's very interesting that you mentioned that it was not in your horizon to study archaeology when you are a youngster, because I usually teach lecture for youngsters with 18-year-olds, and they really don't know what to do of their life. So yeah, thank you very much for your explanation.
Yeah, no.
Then the first question, let's say, is about the publication of your book, Archaeology and Colonialism. That is a classic because you associate archaeology with colonialism, that was something that was going on for some time worldwide, but you did a very careful analysis of the subject. And the second issue is related to the fact that you related the most ancient past up to the present, passing through historical periods, also breaking barriers between disciplines, the traditional disciplines of prehistory and history, prehistoric archaeology and historical archaeology. So after some time of the publication of this classic, what would you say about the impact and the importance of this kind of approach in the decades after the publication of the book?
Well, I think certainly in Europe and places like Australia, which I know well, then the issue of colonialism becomes an ever more pressing one, really. And thinking about the nature of the world today, thinking about, for instance, rather parochially, what it means to be British, I don't think you can think about those things without thinking about Britain's colonial past, Britain's colonial involvements, but Britain's colonial shame in some way. And for me, I mean, my life's been a series of accidents, really, but for me it was a combination of like you, PP, thinking about the Roman past, for instance, which, you know, I think we both agree is impossible to think about without thinking about colonialism, but then also working in Papua New Guinea, a place that had been the colony of a variety of different countries, and was still coming to terms with its sort of, well, whether it is a post-colonial past or not is debatable, because there are still huge multinationals mining and logging and doing all those. Papua New Guinea is not formally a colony of anywhere, but it is very much enmeshed within the global capitalist world. So thinking about a combination of those things really got me to think about archaeology and colonialism, and you know, a statement of the obvious, that the thing that archaeology can offer a study of colonialism, which perhaps is less obvious to other disciplines, is the material dimension. What difference does this make to landscapes? What difference does colonialism make to material culture? What difference does it make to the nature of the body? I mean, all of those sorts of things, I think, are extraordinarily important. And, you know, if one thinks from Mesopotamia or wherever one starts onwards in terms of colonial relationships, then that gives you the possibility of a whole series of comparative case studies, which again no other discipline can really come to grips with. And that's, of course, not to belittle the historic, you know, the written historical record and all these sorts of things where they exist. But lots of aspects of colonialism were never written about. And the people who did the writing were the colonizers, by and large. So if you want to get any sense of what it was like to be colonized, not that somebody like me really can, but if you want to get any sense at all, then archaeology offers you that possibility, really.
Thanks so much. This is quite instigating, because I remember when the World Archaeological Congress was set up in the 80s, this was the ambience of this period. But interesting, it took some time to reach the discipline as a whole, archaeology. So, and then we can go to the next, your next classic. This is a small book, a short introduction to prehistory in this marvelous Oxford series. And I suspect that these small books are very important because they enable any reader to have an access to very different subjects in a short time But in your case specifically, what I would like to show about, or what you think about, is on prehistory was and still is usually considered as very specialized discipline. Lithics, pottery, and classifications, names, difficult names, periods, and so on. But then in this book, you also challenge all of these, and you put prehistory in the present. So I think it was very important because you showed to the overall public another side of the discipline, much more friendly than this very specialized one. So what, in this case, what's your take on the impact of the volume on the discipline of prehistory in general?
Yes, I'm not sure how much impact it's had, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, as you imply,
you are too modest.
No,
That's
no,
the reason.
I don't think I really don't think I am. But archaeology, like any discipline, has a tendency to take inherently interesting subject matter and make it a bit boring. So all those sort of typologies and things, I think, are important, are vital. But if that's all we're doing, then that's not helpful. And a lot of people out there are interested in the deep past. I must say, I wrestled with whether that book should be called Prehistory. Because of the sort of you're implying the sort of presentness. It does divide potentially that term history, which may sound more full and academically worthwhile, from something called prehistory, which is an earlier sort of lesser aspect, and that's not what I wanted to imply at all. And possibly since I've written that book, I've sort of slightly hardened my view and think that I wouldn't be as happy now using the term prehistory for those reasons. Because I think one of the things that we've both wrestled with in our lives is how to be sort of, I don't know, I was going to say egalitarian, but I think equal is, all histories are important. All histories deserve to be told. Some histories are more difficult to recover than others. And also, as in thinking about colonialism, we all have to think about the history of our own discipline, the history of how our thought came to be, and the wider political and social cultural implications of all of those sorts of things. So I wanted to write a book that would be accessible to people. Whether I succeeded or not, I don't really know, because people are interested in the deeper past, the full history of humankind, hominin, pasts, all of those sorts of things, but don't always have the best resources to read, the best resources to think about. So that was my hope, and what I've tried to do over the last few years is to write in a more accessible style for a broader audience. Yeah, again, I'm not sure how far I've succeeded, but I think it's important to try those things.
Well, I think this point is very important because you were concerned to reach a broader audience. In my case, for example, I have published a book on prehistory of Brazil.
Yes.
And I used the opportunity, just as you did in your book, to criticize the very own idea of prehistory. But it's useful to be prehistory, the term, because there are a lot of people who will be lured by the title, by the subject. So yes. It's important.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, well, the next question, before passing the word to Sofia Helena, who will ask you, I have to explain one thing that will be useful for the listeners or viewers in the later on. That's the fact that we at Unicamp, we are very much concerned with feminism and gender issues. And this explains a lot of the interest of our students in those issues of feminism, gender, women. So this is the context of Sofia Helena's question.
Right, yeah.
Okay, Sofia.
Hello, Professor Gosden. For me, it's a great pleasure to be here, have this opportunity to talk with you, because when I am reading your works, I talk with you all the days, in my mind all the days, and have this opportunity to talk with you in the reality is very nice to me. I study Stonehenge, and now I am studying, I am doing a gender study in Stonehenge. So I will read the short version of my question, because I think that you have read already the long version. So what do you say about the presence or the rise of women at Stonehenge? And how about a possible feminist approach?
Yeah, no, I thought, well, yes, to a possible feminist approach, definitely. To answer your question from a slightly sort of outside Stonehenge starting point, I've been reading with trepidation and difficulty a lot of the current ancient genetic evidence. And it seems to me that in places like Europe, the population of the history of Europe can be divided into different phases. And from around 1000 BC onwards, the late Bronze Age getting into the Iron Age, then populations settle down and become more like the populations that are there later on. Whereas in the Neolithic through into the early Bronze Age, people are much more mobile and moving around, and there are many fewer of them. And what this has got me thinking is that all social relations in the Neolithic and early Bronze Age are different to anything we would see later, including, of course, gendered relationships. And I don't know if you know John Robb in Cambridge. He's written a very good paper recently saying it's only from the later Bronze Age onwards that we can see distinctions between men and women in burial that we recognize from later periods. So I think the earlier Neolithic through to the early Bronze Age is extremely challenging and therefore very important to think about gender. But we need to start from the point of view that anything we think about gender in the present won't apply to that period of the past. So I think, and there's a good implication in your question, I think, which is that people studying Stonehenge haven't thought enough about gender. I think I take that to be one of your implications, and if that is true, I agree with you totally. So I think there's a lot that can be done in the Stonehenge case, and an obvious starting point, which is a tricky one but possible, is the various cremation burials that are found around the inside of the Stonehenge bank, and which some of which have had DNA and other analysis done on them. And there's the starting point there of talking about men and women, but quite how one starts that thought and conversation, I think, is extremely challenging. And I think it's fantastic that you, the younger generation, who are not burdened by as many preconceptions and old ways of thinking as someone like me is much more likely to be able to approach these things in a much fresher and more thoughtful manner.
Sofia, you would like to continue on the Stonehenge issue subject? You have another question?
Yes, I think that I can make the last one of my questions, and after pass to Filipe, maybe. Thank you for the answer, Professor. I am to see in Stonehenge not only in the prehistory of Stonehenge, but also in Geoffrey of Monmouth context, John Albrecht context of the women in the time of these writing accounts also.
Yeah.
And so the last one of my specific part of Stonehenge. What do you say about the so-called Dark Ages of Stonehenge between its flood and the Roman arrival? The time that we don't know what is going on, the migrations and things like that.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of activity in and around, as you know, in and around Stonehenge after the sort of formal end of the construction of Stonehenge. And I think one of the things that we're all very interested in the past, but so were people in the past. So I think people were continuously fascinated by the past, and Professor Funari mentioned the World Archaeological Congress, and Peter Rucko, who was the moving spirit in all of that. And one of the many things that Peter wrote about was the later history of Stonehenge, and how people approached Stonehenge in the medieval period, in the Roman period. And I mean, one could say a variety of things, but I think you could say that people approached Stonehenge partly with a sort of positive fascination, but partly also negatively. There were destructions of various stones and so on that happened in the medieval period, possibly because it was associated with, devil worship or aspects of, that thought that came out of Christianity and were applied to the past. One of the things, and this is not quite in answer to your question, but I hope is useful somewhere along the line. Again, one of the things I've come to think about religion is that we tend to think, certainly in the present, we tend to think of religious belief as something that we have personally, that we carry around with us. We believe in, Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, whatever. I think in many periods of the past, religion, if one can call it that, and it's a difficult term, I won't necessarily go into that now because that's a whole train of thought, but religious and ritual activity was much more place-based. So people came into somewhere like Britain from the outside in the Beaker period and still kept working with and on Stonehenge. So they came in not so much bringing their own notions of ritual and religion with them, but they reacted to the religious activities that they found in a particular place. And Stonehenge was very important in sort of grounding incomers in that particular world of southern Britain. And I think those things carried on through, say, into the early medieval period, where Anglo-Saxon people came into Britain and were still very, taken by these ancient monuments. So I hope that's a helpful thought in some way.
Well, I would like to comment that Chris mentioned Peter Rucko. And about the subject of these megaliths and stones. And I remember that I was, as a young student, staying at home with Peter Rucko when he was writing about this. He was showing me some of the what was he was writing or thinking about the subject. So it's interesting that several decades on, one Brazilian student is going in the same direction.
Yes, yes, yes. And if I could ask you, Sofia, what interests you in Stonehenge?
In my graduation, I was interested in history of science and history of religion.
Okay.
I didn't know what I was trying to study, but I started to religion and science. And after reading your text, introduction of prehistory, and read Cliff Glamby also, and I was started to search an object to make this question, and I found Stonehenge, and just now in master degree that I am trying to study gender in Stonehenge. I just studied the historic accounts of Stonehenge, Flinders Petrie, Hawkins, and Richard H. Atkinson. So just for now that I am trying to study gender in the medieval accounts and modern accounts.
Okay. Oh no, it's a fantastic subject matter, and yes, no, very well chosen. I look forward to seeing what you write eventually.
And it's interesting that science and Sofia mentions science and religion, and your recent book on magic, because the idea that moderns used to explain either as a religious intention, for example, Stonehenge, or either as a scientific observation of the universe or whatever. So that are the two modern concepts applied to a completely different period in society. The same applies to the Mayas too, for example.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So yes, part of being an archaeologist is always self-critique, how far we're bringing modern notions to apply to past people. And the only thing we can really be sure about past people is that they weren't like us. So if we start with any thought that they might have been, then we're already in big trouble, I think.
When I start to study about Stonehenge in history of science, I didn't have the history of magic. I think that you didn't have published it, and now I read it, and oh my God, it's very important to my work now.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah. No. Well, I enjoyed writing that book. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Sofia. Then, Filipe.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Yeah.
Well, Professor, welcome. It's a honor for us. Thank you very much for having accepted our invitation. It's a honor. I would like to ask something I'm a professor at the university that studies history of the present time, always. Right. And well, I have researched something on Roman Empire and slavery and antiquity, classics. And always there's always someone asking me, well, why does it matter to study Roman Empire and antiquity? And why to study these objects in the present times? Well, so I think that's a question that everyone in this meeting in some moment they have to answer.
Absolutely.
So we have a lot of possible answers for this question. And I remember that when I was reading your book, Archaeology and Colonialism, I remember a quote when Professor Gosden said, the human contact is a basic human fact.
Right. Yeah.
I remember I always quote it in my classes and used to talk with all right. So I would like to ask you, Professor, what's the importance? Why does it matter to study the prehistory in the present times? But beyond, the study of the past always must be the study of the past always something to the present. It's something that I would like to hear you talking about it. Thank you.
Yes. No, well, I think it's a really, really good question and something that we are asked all the time and we should be asked all the time. So my answer right now would be that we're in a mess globally, that we need to change the way in which we live. Obviously, our relationship with the planet can't continue, won't continue. There is no doubt about that. Our relationship with each other often shouldn't continue as it is. And the only way of really thinking about alternative futures, in a sense, is to think about alternative pasts. Because I think the way in which we conceive of the past and the future is always connected. So for much of the 19th and 20th centuries, people tended to think of human history long term as being a history of progress, of improvement, of amelioration, and therefore you looked at the future in terms of progress and things getting better. So the past, notions of the past do constrain our notions of the future. And I think we're obviously in a period now where we're rethinking the past. Now, most people can't really sustain a sense that the future will be better than the past, and therefore that human history in the long term is a history of progress. So I think many of those sort of moments of the past which were seen to be progressive, the so-called invention of farming, of settled life, of cities, of states and so on. None of those, I mean, empirically, I think we can see that none of those things happened as we thought they did, 100 years ago. That straight sort of empiricism, farming wasn't invented. It took a long time in many parts of the world to gain a relationship with plants and animals that we might call domesticate, that people weren't in charge of their worlds, that people did settle down often long before they got farming. Some of the early cities were extremely egalitarian, they weren't hierarchical, how they fit within notions of states. So all those sorts of things could be fitted together now into something of a new framework which will free up notions of what the future might be like. If we don't think about the human past in terms of dominating the planet, dominating each other, then maybe we can stop thinking about the future in those sorts of terms. Not to say that any of this will be easy at all, but I think it then opens up greater possibilities for thinking about a broadly more sort of, egalitarian, participatory set of notions of our relationships with each other and our relationships with the world around us.
Very good, and it's something that goes far beyond from the idea that something like history as magistra vitae, it's not only to learn from the past, but think that our world is historical, and it can change it. So, thank you very much, Professor.
No, pleasure. Well, good luck with rethinking the future and all those rethinking your past.
Many thanks.
Well, to conclude our interview with you, we would like to ask you about what would you say to youngsters, to young students, in general, and particularly in the social sciences, humanities, history, but in general too, considering what you said about the challenges of the present in relation to nature, to human contact and everything else that you mentioned already. In this context, I see, and several people say that there is some kind of anxiety by the young people, considering that we are in the end of the world. It will end in this generation, and this, as we know, this happened several times in the past. But the youngsters don't know that. So, so what would you say about to the students, to these young students, about the purpose of studying, of still persevering in acting and changing the world?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you're right. There is, unfortunately, a sort of rising tide of anxiety, which is, sort of objectively a correct response in many ways, because there are many reasons to be anxious about all sorts of things. So the state of the planet, our political structures, the various possibilities of repression. But I also feel, and this is easier for me to say as someone, sort of older, I also feel optimistic because of the nature of the younger generation. I think, people in their 20s, 30s and so on have a much more sort of open and fluid notion of the way in which the world works, of notions of race, of notions of sexuality, notions of gender. And I think there's possibilities there of building quite a new set of commensalisms of being together, that my generation would be totally incapable of imagining. So I think there are extraordinary difficulties, but I think many of the younger generation have the sort of deeply felt tools to consider and conceive of new ways of thinking. I'm writing a rather mad new book at the moment, which is the history of the world, which I always feel very embarrassed. It's called Humans the First 7 Million Years, and it's going to take me a little while yet, because I haven't quite. I'm writing about the Americas at the moment, which is the part of the world, so South and Central America. So I've been reading your material, Filipe, which has been fantastic, and it is just so mind-blowing to me. But one of the central concepts that I'm trying to pull together is the notion of the commons. So things that we share in common. So certainly in the English-speaking world, the idea of the commons came out of a sort of physical. There are spaces where people can graze their cattle, grow things together, do things together. But I'm trying to broaden out a notion of the commons to think about cultural resources altogether. So something like language would be an aspect of the commons, because that's something that we all share, that binds us together, that despite various attempts, nobody controls. It's something that we all participate in, we all contribute to in minor ways, we all benefit from massively. And thinking about human history in terms of sort of growing the commons, and shared sets of skills and resources, and those sorts of things, if we are to, come out of the mess that we're in something of a positive light, I think notions of the commons will be crucial. And with writing that magic book, my definition of magic was participation, human participation in the universe, which I think, again, we need to think more about. And many indigenous people are way ahead of us in terms of thinking in those, it's the poor old Westerners that are slowly catching up with the way in which most of the world thinks of the world as animate, as sentient, as something to be cared for, to be part of, rather than something that we dominate. And so I think if people like, in some ways, even though I'm writing this history of the world, if people like me could step back a bit and let other people have thoughts and contributions, and particularly the younger generations, then I think things will be all right.
Well, thanks so much for the inspiring words. I'm sure that the youngsters will feel impelled to think anew their own lives. So it's very interesting. I would say that you, in this last question, you proved to be, again, very British, because the Académie Française would dispute what you say about the control of the language. They try and control the language.
That's very true.
But try and but it's only an attempt, let's say. But anyway, thanks so much for your thoughts and for the interview. It was amazing. We would like to thank you so much, and we'll edit it slightly. We'll put subtitles, and we will also later on publish it in paper, translated into Portuguese too.
Oh wow!
So that I would like to thank you, and so that it was a pleasure to see your openness in action. We've seen your openness in several lectures, so including interviews with different people, including on the magic issue. It's very challenging interviews, but anyway, but you are a charming person, and thank you so much, Professor.
No, well, it was a great pleasure to talk to the three of you, and difficult questions, worthwhile questions, and I've learned a lot and got a lot out of it. And I do think, Brazilian archaeology, the tiny little bit I know, is so exciting. So no, I'm sure it will be even more so in the future. So great pleasure for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We can stop the recording. Thank you so much, Chris. It was a pleasure. And as soon as we have the